Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Beyond the Blueprint. Over the past few weeks, I've been trying to understand something that at first felt very straightforward, but then slowly started to feel much more complicated. The Delhi Mumbai Industrial Corridor. On paper, it's exactly the kind of project that seems like it should work, right? You build infrastructure, you improve connectivity, you create industrial zones, and the expectation is that growth follows. That's the logic I initially started with, and for a while, it made complete, absolute sense. But the more I read, the more I researched, the more I found myself coming back to a completely different question. Not about what the project is, but about what the project changes. The DMIC is massive. It stretches across multiple states, follows a dedicated freight corridor between Delhi and Mumbai, and is designed to create entire industrial regions along the way. It's not about faster movement, but about trying to reshape where production happens and how economic activity is distributed across space. And once you start thinking about it in that way, it feels less like a single project and more like a long term attempt to influence how development unfolds. Most discussions around the DMIC start from a much broader concern. India's manufacturing sector has not grown in the way that many policymakers have expected. Compared to other countries that industrialized earlier, India has seen a large shift from agriculture into services without a strong manufacturing phase in between. And that creates a problem. That's where the problem lies. Because manufacturing has traditionally been one of the few sectors capable of absorbing a large number of workers with like a horde of different skill levels. So when manufacturing underperforms, it's not about output, it's about employment, income distribution, and the structure of the economy. So one way to understand the DMIC is an attempt to try to change that trajectory, to create conditions where manufacturing can expand and ideally play a much larger role in the economy. That's the idea, and it's a compelling one. But the more I thought about it in depth, the more I felt like the idea depends on several other things going right at the same time, which is not perfect. The first thing that stood out to me was how much this depends on how firms actually behave. It's easier to say that if you build infrastructure, firms will come. But firms don't make decisions based on infrastructure alone. They think about policy, stability, regulation, access to basic labor, cost structures, and long term predictability. The infrastructure helps, but it doesn't remove all the other constraints. And that's what made me rethink something really basic. Infrastructure doesn't create growth in isolation, it creates conditions under which growth can happen if all the other factors align. The second thing that kept coming up was the idea of movement. If a firm sets up in a new industrial zone, it looks like growth. But where did the activity actually come from? Was it newly created? Was it shifted from another region? We don't know. At a local level, everything looks like expansion. But at a national level, it might just be reallocation. And that distinction really matters because a project can look successful within the corridor while not necessarily increasing economic output by as much as expected. The same issue can come up with employment. There's a strong expectation that industrial corridors will create a large number of jobs. But manufacturing today is changing. It's more automated, it's more capital intensive, it's less dependent on a large number of workers. So even if production increases, employment may not increase at the same rate, and it may actually decrease if you think about it. And that changes the way we evaluate this project. This project also creates a more specific question, like what kind of jobs are being created, or like who are they accessible for? Because if the jobs require skills that a large part of the workforce does not have yet, the benefits become much more concentrated. Another issue that doesn't get discussed enough is land. Projects like the DMIC require large amounts of land, and that land is never empty. It's already part of someone's livelihood. So when land is acquired, what's happening is not just development, it's displacement and a shift in how the land is used and who benefits from it. And those costs don't always show up clearly in how projects are evaluated, but they definitely matter, right? At this point, I started thinking more seriously about how projects like this are actually evaluated on a larger scale, because a lot of the justification comes down to a cost benefit analysis. And this is where things become much less straightforward. A cost benefit analysis is often presented as a clear framework. You estimate the cost, you estimate the benefits, and if the benefits exceed the cost, then the project is justified. But in practice, almost everything in that calculation depends completely on assumptions. Take productivity gains, for example. The idea that better infrastructure reduces costs and improves efficiency. But how much efficiency? How quickly is it going to show up? These numbers are not directly observable. They depend on how firms respond, how much how fast the investment comes in, and how the broader economy evolves. Then there's discounting. Many of the benefits of projects like the DMIC are expected far into the future. The cost benefit analysis will bring those future benefits into present terms using a discount rate. And small changes in that rate can significantly change whether a project looks worthwhile or not. Then there's also the issue of what gets counted. Some things are easy to measure, like transport efficiency, output growth, investment flows. But other things are harder: displacement, regional inequality, and environmental impact, to name a few. These are often included, but they are much harder to quantify, and sometimes that's why they carry less weight in the final calculation. Another thing that stood out to me is how uncertain these projects are. If investment arrives quickly, the project looks strong. If it's delayed, the benefits shrink. If global conditions change, the entire trajectory can just shift. So instead of giving a clear single answer, it's really outlining a range of possible outcomes. Then let's talk about financing. These types of projects require large upfront investments, and that investment has to be funded before the benefits appear. In many cases, this involves a mix of public funding and private participation. Public funding plays a key role because the returns are long term and are not always directly captured by private investors. But that also means the risks are public. So if the project underperforms, the costs don't disappear, it's absorbed over time. Private investment introduces a completely different dynamic. It depends on expected returns. If the returns are uncertain, investment may be slower or more selective than planned. And then sustainability is not just environmental sustainability, but economic sustainability. A project like this needs to remain viable over decades upon decades. It needs to keep attracting firms, keep supporting production, and keep adapting to the changes in conditions that change every hour. If it doesn't, the initial investment becomes much harder to justify over time. So now, when I look at the DMIC, I don't see a simple answer. I see a project with real potential, but also one where the outcome depends heavily on a range of factors that come together over time. And I think that's what makes it worth studying. That's what makes it worth researching. Not because it gives clear answers, but because it forces you to think more carefully about how development actually happens. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, the goal here is to look beyond the blueprint and understand what these projects actually mean once you sit with them long enough. Thank you.